Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 223, and we're going to talk about cooperation versus socialism. And we're going to use the recent events concerning FEMA after Hurricane Helene. Just want to give a shout out to all of the new listeners from Sweden. I have no idea why anyone from Sweden would want to listen to this podcast, but hej och välkommen till kanalen. I was surprised to see how similar it is to German. I studied German for many, many years. But props to Sweden for not locking down as the rest of the world did. I shared multiple times videos and articles about Sweden and how things weren't noticeably any worse or than all the other countries which had locked down. So props to that country. My son had mentioned that currently, because of all of the immigration, that country is struggling quite a bit. I hope it gets resolved quickly so that you guys can continue to be the country that you have been all of these years. Well, anyway, so I mentioned before that um, after Hurricane Helene, it seemed that FEMA was deliberately dragging their feet while trying to slow down other people's efforts to help people struggling with the recovery. I did mention, however, that this might be their actual accelerated speed, right? They were trying to move as quickly as possible, and still it was slower than molasses, which like honey or something that flows really slowly. Anyway, so without the internet and without the speed of information sharing on platforms like X, most people probably would never have realized that FEMA was as slow as they were. Seeing federal workers in five-star hotels telling everyone the reason why they're not doing anything is because they received no orders. Um, so without those social media platforms, most people probably would still be in the dark with the response times and the nature of the response of this federal bureaucracy. And on my X page, I've shared some videos and pictures or between X and my Facebook of how federal employees were actually interfering with private citizens trying to give assistance to people they knew were in trouble. And there were positive and negative stories going either way. Nevertheless, given the history of incompetence of FEMA, why should this time be any different? That this is sort of normalized incompetence, normalized feet dragging. So with platforms like X, people on the ground were able to get information out. They were able to advise and direct people in terms of what to send, where to send it, so that people could get help quickly. So this whole situation, looking back on it, and it is still ongoing, I am sure, for a great many people, we can learn a few things. In other words, this gives us a few lessons that we should take note of moving forward. Number one, people closer to the problem prioritize the most urgent needs first, right? Because, in other words, priorities are different between being a private citizen and a government bureaucracy. So government bureaucracies is all about protocol. It's all about, okay, what are the steps that we need to go through? What's the process that we need to follow? And generally that slows down response. But people who are actually there in the flood zone, in the problem areas, people whose homes were washed away, people who are stuck somewhere and need help, need medicine, need medical supplies, those people who know them, who may be relatives, who may be friends, who understand that these people have a day of food left or a day of medicine left, they are going to prioritize the most urgent needs first. They know firsthand, and so they're going to, act on it immediately. They're not going to wait a couple of days before they receive orders and then go through their list of priorities, go through their steps that they have determined years ago for a different kind of disaster, for a different kind of community, especially a community that everyone is a stranger, right? Also, keep in mind that, and I watched a couple of channels and they were stating how the needs are changing daily, right? So initially they need blankets, they need water, and then they started talking about different kinds of things that needed to be sent, like generators and things of that nature. So it's not over weeks and months that needs are changing, but they're changing every couple of days. And a federal bureaucracy cannot respond that quickly. I mean, it takes days just to gather information and know what to do, where to set up. And so they cannot move as swiftly as a decentralized, multiple groups of people organizing spontaneously addressing the specific needs in that specific location. So the wheels of socialism, because that is what government bureaucracies are, arms of socialism, they move very slowly, particularly because they are not the ones who are in need. They are not the ones who are suffering. They are not the ones who are in pain. They have to follow, as I said, they have to follow procedures, which are usually codified. And if they don't follow procedure, then they are subject to liability, right? People can sue them because they broke protocol, because they didn't do what they were supposed to. By following the protocol, it relieves them of that legal liability, right? The potential for them being sued, especially if someone gets hurt. And so these protocols, these procedures are hard to change, very difficult to modify, and almost impossible to adapt to the variety of situations that uh, would arise due to a hurricane that is spread out over three different states with three different geographies, with three different sets of needs. And that's only talking about it generally. When you get more specific to each location, then the variety increases. Also, if you have a government bureaucracy in the socialistic mentality, you need offices, and then you need to give titles and ranks and so hierarchy to these organizations. You need to give them medical plans. You have to figure out who is qualified to do something which happens only occasionally every year in different various locations all over the country. So that process alone requires an immense amount of time, resources, aka money, none of which is going towards disaster relief. So voluntary cooperation is faster, much, much faster. Communication, transport, because you're tapping into the desire of people's desire to help other people, which ignores cost, which ignores issues of liability and safety, right? It relies on people who are on the ground, the people who have local knowledge, who have the best and the most accurate knowledge, right? There is no condescension like, oh, I'm from the federal government, you are just this backwater hick. I know more than you, I have more authority than you, so you obey me, which I'm sure happens a lot. Just seeing those helicopters fly over volunteer, collection centers and blowing away their canopies and tents, that if that doesn't if that doesn't speak, condescension and, a superiority complex, I don't know what would. So people who are engaging in voluntary action, they're doing it out of their own generosity, out of compassion, out of empathy, imagining that you or your loved ones um, are the ones who are struggling on the ground. And so for that, it motivates. I've said this before, but when there are natural disasters in any other different country, the United States is the number one donor for charities, right? More than any other country in the world, obviously because it has the most resources. But also, that's sort of the attitude of a lot of people in America, the desire to help other people. Maybe it's glory seeking, maybe it's a hero complex, whatever, but it's there. And so Americans in general are very generous with their charity, with donating time or money or supplies to other people who on the surface seem to need it much, much more than we may at this moment. All right. So businesses were donating equipment, businesses were donating stock that they had set aside to sell, but they are then going to use it to donate for people who are in need because they recognize the life and death potential that these donations carry with it. So then it's a kind of a beautiful thing, right? People who make these donations, they care about the donations that they make. They're more likely to follow the course of these donations and even want to seek out information about the people that they helped, right? And so this is something which causes these donations to be less likely to be wasted. I am sure there are scammers, right? Con artists people who are going to sort of try to find opportunities to loot, that is, steal from victims. I'm sure that is also very, very possible. But to deny the potential good from all of the other donations, I think far outweighs the potential for looting, which is a much smaller percentage, right? Because these looters will probably, uh, be outed very quickly and also would be risking a lot to get whatever uh, meager loot that they could find, if they could even find people who are trapped and who are desperate. So you have this phenomena of a huge outpouring of generosity, which is far superior in some ways, right, than the federal government. Now you got to recognize too that um, some of the equipment that only the federal government can afford, one might argue that if the federal government wasn't buying up all of these resources, the costs would be uh, much lower, that there would be more available for local agencies, even private citizens, right? So that's something to keep in mind too. It's not that, oh, the federal government is the only entity that can afford all of this stuff. No, I'm sure that people would come up with creative ways to be able to have this equipment, profit from it, and then also use it for emergencies such as Hurricane Helene. Now, people will try to harness this generosity through the bureaucracy of the state. They said, oh, this kind of disaster is going to happen in the future. We should prepare for it. And, we need a government agency to oversee all of it, right? And so just to have, some people employed just in case to put into action all this goodness, but the problem is once you put it into the hands of the state, it now is coercive. It is no longer voluntary, right? You are taxed. Money is collected from you. Even when there is no emergency, you have to pay into, this fund, which you're not even really sure is going to that fund, right? And given the $35 trillion in debt, it's more likely than not that the percentage of money, excuse me, that you donated is going to be used not for charity, but for something else. There's no close contact. You become detached, right? Your donation, then your taxation becomes detached from you and the actual disaster and the victims. It is no longer voluntary. It could be the very same action. It could be used for the very same kind of disaster. But if it's required, if it's forced, if the donations are solicited at gunpoint, then it won't happen in the same way, right? Most of the people, all of the people working for the federal government are paid, right? So part of your so-called donation are going to pay for bureaucrats who do pretty much nothing most of the year. So prioritization doesn't happen according to the needs of the people on the ground who are victims of whatever natural disaster, but the prioritization happens according to the convenience of the federal employee, right? By their priorities, by their protocol, by their own personal safety, right? So safety is an issue. Oh, we can't go in there, it's too dangerous. But that safety issue and protocol becomes less of a concern for someone who's trying to help their own family. You're willing to take a larger risk if it's someone that you care about. And obviously, there is a positive and negative to that. But if you think about it, right, you are at least able to try if it is on your own dime. There are also, when you have federal bureaucracies involved, there are prearranged contracts, there are predetermined beneficiaries, right? Subcontractors who are going to get the money to be able to do certain things, but they have to get the word first. You got to follow protocol, you got to get the green light, because if you act before that, then maybe those expenses are not covered. So you have to wait for the wheels of socialism to turn in order for you to get the green light, in order to then go and help people. But private individuals, you do it yourself. You decide and then you go. So the bureaucracy creates a kind of money-making scheme, right? We saw this with oil spills as well. People are trying to offer better solutions, better ways of cleaning up oil, and they say, no, no, no. We already know who we're giving all the money to. If we give it to you, then our promise that we made to all these other businesses cannot be kept. Plus, on top of everything else, if there are unused funds, so imagine let's just pretend there are no severe hurricanes for a full year, but you're still collecting taxes. And so now you're like, oh, so we have an extra year of money. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this money for something else. No one will miss it. Like we'll use it for, I don't know, housing illegal immigrants coming to this country, which is what they're doing right now in the United States, right? Where the FEMA website itself is basically saying we're using some of this money for assisting illegals into this country, so much so that they are getting much, much more money than the actual victims of these hurricanes. It's just crazy. So this debacle illustrates why people really don't need the federal government so much. Uh, we should put it in the hands of local systems and support. So imagine if there was less federal interference, then even the Tennessee National Guard, instead of being sent to Texas to prepare for a deployment overseas, they would have stayed in the state to assist and help people who are in need. But, so it was like the hurricane hit, and like the next day, excuse me, the Tennessee National Guard was sent to Texas to train to be sent to the Middle East. But that's not what the National Guard is for. The National Guard is for protecting and restoring order on the local level. And why do we have a National Guard? Because of posse comitatus, right? You are not allowed to use the U.S. military on domestic soil, right? That way you can prevent, a government, a rogue government from turning the army against the everyday person. And we're seeing in the news that they're trying to pass a law to get around posse comitatus, which is often, suspended at the convenience of a president. It happens a lot, as a matter of fact. Uh, but at least they're still talking about it. And so what do I mean by that? Well, states, if they realize that they are responsible, that they cannot rely on FEMA, then they are going to set up their own system of disaster relief, which would be much more targeted to the needs of that state. I mean, there are 50 states in the union. Each state has different needs. Some probably don't even have the kinds of natural disasters that other states have. Like for example, Kansas will never see a hurricane, but they always see tornadoes. And so, that's what you need. You need the local level to try to address the needs of their situation rather than what someone in Washington, D.C., declares or prioritizes as the need, based on nothing, right? They have no information, no knowledge of the area, and yet they're going to tell everyone what they need to do, even to prepare. So one example is snowstorms, right? The South rarely sees snowstorms, but in my area where I'm living, snowstorms are not handled very well at all. There are some streets which never get their streets plowed by the city, right? So when it snows a lot, a couple feet or a foot or 6 inches, right, the streets have to be plowed, so then traffic can move freely. But because they are not plowed and cars drive over it, the snow gets packed, which turns into ice, and then it takes a long time for the ice to melt, particularly because of the way the streets are. It doesn't get a lot of sun, and so the streets, they stay covered in very slippery snow slash ice for the entire winter. And so it's so frustrating that a lot of people started hiring subcontractors on their own with their own money to plow their street because the city just won't do it. So, but then one has to argue, why do you pay taxes then? Okay. And then I thought, well, what do you do in other cities that have much, much more snowfall? Chicago has feet of snow, right? They measure their snowfall not in inches like we do in my city, but in feet. And so how do they clear the snow so quickly? And what they've decided to do was have snow drop-off locations. And so they have 500 locations where snow trucks, right, trucks which gather up all the snow from the street, they can dump all of that snow. 500 locations all over the city for that explicit purpose, compared to New York City, which I think is at least the same size, maybe even bigger, but only has 50 locations, right? So 500 versus 50. I know you can make the argument that, hey, real estate is more expensive in New York City, and so to have 500 empty plots is super expensive. Yeah, well, but you got Central Park, right? Which is like a park in the middle of the city. Why not just dump a whole lot of snow there? Right. So, that would probably be equivalent to 500 different locations, but apparently they don't really do that. And of course, because of environmental restrictions, they can't dump the snow into the river, the bay, the lake, whatever. They can't dump it into bodies of water because of pollutants in that water. But once you send it up to the federal level, there's apathy on the part of the people. The state will take care of it. So if you remove the federal interference, it leads to more preventative measures, right? People are more focused on prevention, better construction of roads, of housing, of even dams. And so people probably will also prevent disasters by also reconsidering where they're going to build, that if they are going to build in a flood-prone zone, they're going to build their house in a way that will withstand that flood, will survive a flood or a tornado or a hurricane or a tsunami, right? And so this is what's going to happen. If more responsibility is given to you, then you are going to make more effort to research to protect your assets, right? So less government interference means less moral hazard, which means more responsibility, more proactivity, and cutting down on the damages caused by these natural disasters. That's it for this episode. I will talk to you next time.